All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming early on the last day of what's been a great conference so far. I'm really excited to talk about disinformation and the challenges we're dealing with data integrity and trust on the internet. And so we've got a great panel today. I know that Danielle mentioned on Monday, we originally had a third panel member as well, Camille Francoise, but she unfortunately could no longer make it, but she sent her regrets, and I think we have a phenomenal panel still. So what I'd like to first start off with is just some quick introductions. And so start off with, and each of our panel members will just give you a little bit of a background on themselves as well, because each of us bring fairly different perspectives and come from different roles in how we approach disinformation. And so I think across it, I think there's some unique perspectives that help guide, and our experiences help guide some of our insights on this important issue. So start with Melanie Ensign to my right. She is the head of security, privacy, and engineering communication at Uber. And then we also have Renee DiResta, who's the research manager at Stanford Internet Observatory. And I'm Andrea Limbago, so I'll be chiming in a little bit as well. My background originally was in academia as a political scientist, did some computational social science in the Department of Defense before going to a couple of different startups that focus on security and protection. And so a lot of my input that you'll see is guided by both government, academic, and then more private sector research that I've been doing and looking at how the different organizations and groups actually look at disinformation. So that's a little bit where I will be coming from. Melanie, do you want to give a little bit on your background?
Thanks, Andrea. So my background, my initial background is actually in marine biology. I wanted to be a shark scientist when I was growing up. I ended up in a PR agency, actually, after college, working on environmental communication. So my graduate studies and my master's thesis was really focused on corporate sustainability and the role of corporate communicators, not solely in the dissemination of messaging, but how to actually be the conduit for external feedback so that companies were making more informed decisions about their environmental footprint and various corporate sustainability efforts. Like a lot of people in security, I think I got here by accident, but I will say that sharks and hackers have a lot in common. So I do get to use a lot of what I learned in school. I started my communication career in an agency. I worked in an agency as a consultant for about 6 years with different security clients, mostly non-security companies who were trying to educate customers and other stakeholders on various security issues. And because of that, I've been exposed to the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to communication as a business. So a little bit later on, we'll talk about some of the industry infrastructure and incentives that are contributing to misinformation with marketing and advertising and public relations. And then I came to Silicon Valley. I've now been at Uber for almost 4 years. And so, like I mentioned, I will be discussing a lot of the legitimate business practices that are actually enabling some of the campaigns that Andrea and Renee will touch on.
Hi, excuse me. Hi, Renee DiResta. I'm at Stanford Internet Observatory now. My background way back was actually computer science and political science, and I minored in Russian, and that was in 2004. So my parents didn't really understand why I was doing that, and the honest answer was I wanted to take a foreign language, and I basically failed out of both Arabic and Hindi and down into Russian. So, and the political science was because it was a nice GPA boost versus the engineering classes I was taking, if we're being totally candid here. I had a kind of a winding career path. I actually went to Wall Street. I was a quant trader at a company called Jane Street for a while. I was a market maker. I did a lot of financial modeling. And then after that, I came out here and I started doing venture capital with Tim O'Reilly, and that was sort of my first exposure to the Valley. And this was during the social mobile local revolution, when everybody was very excited about getting like geo-fenced coupons, and nobody wondered about the tracking aspects of what it took to give you those geo-fenced coupons. And admittedly, really, I didn't either. So that was what wound up taking me into the realm of disinformation and misinformation was actually having my first kid in 2013 and then starting to look at anti-vaccine narratives. I was on Facebook, as probably most people are, and I started getting recommendation engine suggestions for things like anti-vaccine groups because I had a baby, and once you have a baby and you start engaging in those communities, it's like Target selling, pushing you the ads for like all the baby furniture and baby clothes. Facebook is like, here, have an anti-vaccine group. So that was how it was in 2015, 2013. What I wound up doing was actually starting to map some of the communication networks, just using social network analysis, looking at how communications were happening on Twitter, looking at ways in which small groups of people were able to sort of disproportionately amplify a point of view, in part because the counter voices weren't there, in part because sensational content was performing well, in part because really basic rudimentary automation could still get things trending back during that time frame in 2015, 2016. And I became kind of an activist about it. So before going into academia, I really did a lot of this, looking at it from the point of view of like a very frustrated parent, actually. Subsequent to that, I wound up working on some of the counter-ISIS efforts, the kind of counter-propaganda. How do we think about societal responses when the social ecosystem becomes a vast propaganda communication machine? And after doing that work through a series of kind of weird events, I wound up doing the Senate Intelligence Committee research into the Russia data set. So I led one of the teams that did the evaluation of the Internet Research Agency data in 2018, and then the GRU, the military intelligence operation, the hack and leak operation in 2019. So we published that in late October of 2019. So I'm going to talk a little bit about comparatively what we saw between these two different adversaries operating simultaneously over that period.
Okay, great, thank you. And so our panel will have a little bit of a different structure than some of the other ones. And what we want to do originally is to lay out the misinformation about disinformation. In discussing and preparing for the panel, there are a variety of different campaigns that we could just dive right into. But for us, we thought it was very important just to lay the foundation and make sure everyone's on the same page as far as the sort of the state of affairs with disinformation. What is what's not, because there is a ton of misinformation about disinformation. And so we'll go through a couple of the different myths for about the first half of the panel. And then we'll each go into, Melanie and Renee go into some different use cases and campaigns that they'll come up here and walk through some slides and go into more detail on those specific research. And then we'll conclude looking at some potential solutions and how to address this growing challenge before getting into Q&A. So what we're going to do is just kick off with debunking some of the myths and misinformation that's out there about disinformation. And one of the first ones, and you see it every day, I think, in the news right now, is that misinformation and disinformation are used at the same time, or to mean the exact same thing within the various clickbait news feeds that we see. And so first thing we want to do is sort of just break down and get some of the vernacular and some of the jargon down and get some of the terminology clarified. And so I think Renee will start with that.
Yes.
It should be right there.
So one of the things that we've tried to think about as we begin to think about countering these things, in early 2017, we started working on taxonomies for describing the kind of nature of problems. Claire Wordle at First Draft roughly bucketed it into a concept called information disorder. And as we segmented out things that were like inadvertently wrong, so just misinformation, things that were wrong online, from disinformation, which the pizza there is actually as an allusion to Pizzagate, because that was happening kind of, it had just happened. But the idea that then there were people who were doing things that with a deliberate intent to mislead and deceive. Started looking at ways in which the difference between intent, were there ways to kind of quantify or understand a notion of intent in understanding how we treated these things, because something that was accidentally wrong is very different than something that is deliberately wrong in terms of the intent of the actor behind it to communicate it to people. Then there was propaganda, which was just kind of, it's communication with an agenda, but it's a thing that's been around for centuries. And so some of our attempt to understand where that kind of delineation between propaganda and disinformation was actually took us back to definitions from the early 1920s through to the 1960s, an understanding of propaganda as having kind of black, white, and gray types. White propaganda is quite easily attributable. It's something that will come out from a state that will have a state logo on it. RT is a great example of this. You know exactly what it is if you're remotely familiar with the media ecosystem. Then there's this kind of slow spectrum that takes you down into the realm of subversive propaganda, where the actor is obscured, the funder is obscured, the reason that it exists is obscured, and so you find yourself looking at things that are communicating information with a very particular slant, but are not, it's not quite clear who's behind it or why. And that's where disinformation kind of rolls up as a tactic in black propaganda operations. Fake news was information that was demonstrably false. That was the way that it originally was intended to be used before it became anything I don't like on the internet. And with fake news in particular, a lot of the motivation there was economic. So people who are economically motivated are behaving, again, differently than people who are motivated ideologically or people who are, running a state-sponsored campaign. And so we tried to have a different, a conceptualization of fake news, which in many ways was actually quite similar to spam, sort of an evolution of kind of like a content spam type model where people would write sensationalist content largely for the purpose of driving someone to a website that had a high ad load and then capitalizing on that. And that was, as you may recall, in 2016, the Macedonian teenagers sites that were running things that, articles like Pope endorses Donald Trump and sensationalist content that was likely to get clicks. And then finally, filter bubbles, that was our way of kind of conceptualizing how the information that you see is in some ways bounded by the environments that you participate in. So filter bubbles have kind of evolved now into conversations a little bit more about echo chambers, or my term for it now is like bespoke realities, where you have these, you're in some ways actively choosing to participate in some of these siloed media environments, but when you're in there, you are seeing media kind of not only, kind of chosen in part because of a particular political alignment, position, or interest you hold, but then you're also kind of telegraphing your interest, and it provides an interesting vector for people who want to transmit malign information of the black propaganda or disinformation variety to people who have particular inclinations to start.
Okay, great. And I think what we increasingly are seeing is more awareness about each of these. And are you noticing that are people responding any differently online, or with growing awareness, do you think, to the various kinds, or do you think that behavior is still almost absent in the understanding of some of the variations in how much data is actually supporting a lot of the information that's out there?
I think there's more awareness that it happens. That's kind of a double-edged sword, because now you see everybody screaming fake news all the time,
right,
or
exactly.
You're a Russian bot all the time. So there's an awareness that the information you see online is not necessarily of the kind of degree of integrity you might have seen if you were getting it from your library or even from less economically incentivized in media environments, and so, or differently incentivized maybe. But that's where I think we see this rising awareness. It doesn't necessarily translate into the ability to detect it in the moment, which is why you still see people sharing things like coronavirus conspiracy theories, because even the act of doing the fact check is very difficult still. Yep. It's hard to know where to fact check to. Wikipedia is kind of the default at this point, but in the moment, people just hit the retweet button because they, are trying to like push the message along, even if the message is a graph of a, distribution pattern of a disease that's not real.
Yep. Yeah, and it's interesting, even along the fact check sites, even some of those actually tend to be, hidden disinformation within it that are actually not, they're fact check sites with an agenda. And so even there, it makes that very hard. And so clearly, it's a complicated landscape at a minimum, and I think it's growing in complexity, which leads into one of the next topics is that when we think about it, we often think about the election. In the United States, when we think about disinformation and fake news and interference, we often think about the 2016 election, and that seems to be the dominant paradigm. But the reality is that it actually is much bigger than elections. You mentioned the coronavirus and some of those conspiracy theories. So Melanie will touch upon some of the broader motivations that are driving disinformation and their impact.
Yeah, sure. Everybody likes to hear that the problem space is actually bigger than we thought. So I do think that the current events in politics, I think, have raised awareness to some of these things, but the reality is that a lot of the objectives, the motivations for for these types of campaigns have existed for thousands of years. What we are seeing now is kind of a new flavor because of the technology and the various distribution platforms that we now have. So if you think about even those of us that deal with like cybersecurity defense, understanding the motivations of are they really adversaries in misinformation? Perhaps. I'm going to call them adversaries. Thinking about the motivations of your adversaries is key to understanding the defense, key to being able to understand when somebody is trying to manipulate you, or even to be able to identify your own vulnerabilities and weaknesses. So very similar to the types of motivations that we see technically in terms of cybersecurity attacks. There's financial motivation, ideological motivation. It can be political, but it can go well beyond elections. And it's interesting, there's a lot, I think when we looked at those categories that you had, Renee, sometimes it can be really hard to distinguish between something that's propaganda versus something that is just a policy awareness effort. But knowing that these types of motivations and objectives exist is the first step in actually being able to identify what the message is, who the messenger is, but also what's expected of you. I think just building resiliency to other people's messages is also something that's really important, and I think that is an analogy that makes sense to a lot of us that work in InfoSec, because we are essentially trying to build resilient networks and systems. And when it comes to misinformation and disinformation, we need to build resilient individuals.
Thanks. And then as far as, looking at some of these in a little bit more detail beyond, the politics beyond elections or something that might be more targeted, I think I'm increasingly seeing, there was some stalkerware discussion last night here, and you're starting to see some more of the targeting both on individuals and as companies. I think similar to how motivations are growing, I think some of the targets and the victims of a lot of the disinformation attacks is a broad range of actors as well. Honestly, very similar to what we're seeing in cyber on that side too. So there are some parallels which I think are interesting to look at in that realm. And then especially if you look at some of the politics beyond the elections, some of the social divisions that are created and are some of the main efforts, those get into both geopolitical efforts, but they're also can be driven by various kinds of almost grassroots levels, societal unrest. I don't know if Renee, do you want to add anything else to this, or got it covered?
It'll come up in the...
Yeah, and that's why all these will be coming up throughout some of the campaigns as well. But first, we really want to just lay the landscape out for everyone, make sure we're understanding just how broad and widespread some of these aspects are, and make sure we're on the same page. And so, which gets into one of the next aspects, actually, and when we think about disinformation, I think probably most people think about Russia, at least the United States. That seems to be almost used hand in hand. And unfortunately, it is not just limited to Russia by any stretch of the imagination. And so Renee will go into a little bit of the landscape of the who's who in this area.
Is the next...
And the next one, you want to do that one? Oops.
Oh, just...
There we go.
There we go, yeah. I was going to say, I wasn't sure if the visual would make its way in. Yeah, so one of the opportunities I've had over the last few years, as I mentioned, I started looking at conspiracy theorists, and then I worked on the counterterrorism, and then following that, state actors. I personally focus primarily on state actors now, but our understanding is a little bit, the infrastructure of the social ecosystem is what provides the opportunity to run these campaigns. And because it's low cost and low barrier to entry, and there's really no consequences, you're going to lose your account, like big deal, it's not significant deterrence. What we see is that increasing numbers of different types of actors across the political spectrum, across the world, have chosen to participate in this, in part because they believe that if they don't, they're kind of ceding the ground to their political opponents. And so we do see it actually quite a bit. And it is a global problem. State actors are the best resourced, so particularly Russia. Russia is the most sophisticated, I would say, of the adversaries that I've had an opportunity to do firsthand research on. There's an extraordinary commitment to a long game that we see out of Russia that we haven't seen to the same extent from others. Iran maybe a little bit. Saudi Arabia and China, in their social influence campaigns, they kind of throw up, bots and automated accounts and sock puppets at opportune political times, but they don't really have the same evidence of the deep, long, sustained commitment to these campaigns that we see from Russia, and again, to a slightly lesser extent, Iran. The terrorists use it mostly as a propaganda recruitment tool. And it's much more of a kind of a radicalization and recruitment cycle. So they put out their propaganda. ISIS used to do this on Twitter all the time. But the goal was really always to pull people into private messaging apps. So they would use propaganda in part because having overt propaganda is actually kind of a sign. It's seen as a sign of power. It's demonstrating that you are putting out a message as yourself. You are an organization. You are a force to be reckoned with. You are official. And so propaganda for an organization like ISIS is used to reinforce the perception that they are effectively a state actor. And that was how they wanted to be seen at the time. So that type of behavior was much more to kind of reinforce the glory of the caliphate and then to recruit people into these kind of private channels when they would engage with the content online. Domestic ideologues, again, this is the really hard one, right? This is, I've got a Pepe up there, but there's another couple of Twitter icons that could have just as easily been. And that's because what we see again is that where is that line between coordinated inauthentic activity and digital activism? And in our early understanding of the problem, we thought about it from the standpoint of like, who is the actor? Is it Russia? Oh, then it's fake. But then we began to look at it from the standpoint of overlapping techniques with spam and things like that, and looking at it more as a kind of behavioral models and dissemination models, as opposed to who is behind it. The other two, the spammers I mentioned, again, just kind of financially motivated, but they're really remarkably, kind of at the front lines of of trying things out. And then the true believers are more the kind of conspiratorial groups that are wholly ideologically motivated and in some ways do kind of overlap with the domestic ideologues.
Great, thank you. And so clearly, again, very similar to on the cyber domain, where we see a lot of attacks, the actual attacker set of actors doing it is expanding a ton. Same thing's going on with disinformation, which leads to actually a good segue into, we have not yet talked about any kinds of exploits or vulnerabilities or compromising machines or anything along those lines. So why are we even having a panel on disinformation at a security and privacy conference? And so I was actually asked, I presented something at DerbyCon several years ago that looked at the integration of cyber attacks and disinformation. And there's actually discussion among the audience as far as whether it's even an appropriate topic for the security community. And there was actually an interesting back and forth where some people felt very strongly that it's not, and some people felt very strongly that it is. And so this is a next myth to address, and I think a lot of us believe that we are here, so we believe that it is very relevant for the work that we're all doing within this community, and I think Melanie will talk some about that.
Sure. So the first thing I want to say is for people who think that cybersecurity and the industry of information security is really just about data protection, things are going to change very quickly for you. We have already seen a trend in the industry where some of these non-traditional cyber issues, whether it's fraud or platform abuse or integrity, these things are falling within the responsibility of security teams within organizations. The big platform teams, I remember a time when the spam fighting teams used to be different from the data protection teams. They all work together now. So this issue of disinformation is increasingly being expected for security teams to actually address. That being said, there's also, as Andrea mentioned, this intersection between what's being called cyber-enabled disinformation. So there is an overlap between cyber attacks and Renee mentioned this as well with trying to hack accounts that have influence that you can then spread information. So there's a number of areas where that overlaps, but the thing that I think is probably most important for this group here is recognizing how we as a community are in fact contributing to the problem. If any of you have a Twitter account and follow anyone in InfoSec, you probably have some inkling of our community's own somewhat inability to discern correct information and not to propagate misinformation or even disinformation. Social media is definitely a difficult area for us as a community. I would consider to be our Achilles heel in terms of information integrity. We are quick to judge. We have knee-jerk reactions. We love to share information that we disagree with, which, by the way, is counterproductive. And at the same time, we have quite a few very loud voices that love to use social media as well as traditional media to spread their own version of whatever they consider to be truth. And that's problematic because we have a lot of people who are presenting commentary on things that they don't actually understand. And there's a whole separate talk and discussion about our relationship with the press and the press's commitment to fact-checking and accuracy as well. But I do want to note that we as a community need to be a lot more discerning and a lot more careful about what we're sharing. If you see an article that is technically inaccurate, don't share it with a mean comment about it. I will tell you the hardest thing or the worst thing you can do if you're trying to get a publication to actually issue a correction on something is to make that piece of content so popular that an editor or the editor's senior editor is scared to change it. Several years ago, I spoke with a tech editor at a publication because they had put up a video seemingly about privacy tips for consumers about a whole bunch of different technologies and products. And one of the things that they were mentioning was a Chrome extension that would allow you to change the UI of a certain website. And in order to use this Chrome extension, you had to give it complete owner rights to your account. So, here's a news outlet that was promoting the use of a highly invasive Chrome extension simply in order to give people the ability to change a website UI. And when I reached out to the editor to explain to them that this was not only inaccurate, but also very dangerous advice for consumers, the response I got was, "This is the most popular video on our site right now, we're not changing it." So I do think it's really important for us as a community to be aware of the fact that sometimes our rage is actually fueling the machine that we are in fact trying to fight.
Great, thank you. And so I think hopefully as we go out throughout the panel, you'll see more and more this intersection of both with the role of our community, the role of cyber-enabled disinformation, and just the broader focus setting as the industry moves towards information integrity. And I think that, at least to me, that's one of those things that I actually was asked by someone a little while ago, what am I looking at now that I wasn't hearing much about 6 months ago? And I think information and data integrity was around a little bit then, not necessarily using those words, but that this notion of integrity really is starting to become more and more relevant. And that's a role that we all have something a role to play in that area. And so on the last myth that we'll cover real quick before getting into some of the campaigns is really this notion that it's mainly coming from abroad, and that's it's going to be and generally a foreign nation-state actor. And just to go quickly onto this, because I think especially in the United States as we get into 2020 elections, I'm still very much worried that we're still looking at 2020 and expecting 2016 to happen again when it's a whole, things have evolved. If you look at what happened in 2016, moving on to 2018 and now, there's more actors, there's more tactics, and there's domestic and international. If you just look at, just on the election side, on election interference, this is from Freedom House, Freedom on the Net, and domestic actors interfered online in 26 of 30 countries that they were looking at that had elections or referendums. And so if you look more into the details of some of those, some of it was shutting off information, so that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it was pushing out misleading information coming from domestic actors. And so it could be everything from the bots to to state-run media sites, to other kinds of websites and spam and so forth. I mean, it's really a broad range of tactics that they were using to push forth alternate narratives to try and influence the elections. And so it by no means is something that happens just here. It's a global phenomenon, and these are in many cases, it's domestic actors that we have to increasingly be thinking about what their role might be. And then to even add on to some of the complexity of that, it's a growing privatization as well that we're seeing. So just as we're seeing a marketplace for hackers for hire, we're seeing a marketplace for basically disinformation and shaping reality for hire from these firms. And so I think it was that the New Yorker had an article on the Psy Group, which was former Mossad, who are now doing influence campaigns with a slogan to shape reality. And they've worked they worked on one of their targets was a hospital board seat in California. So this is like elections at all various levels. We had even at the most local level, which is kind of crazy. The Spamouflage Dragon campaign, that's something that Graphica did. That's Camille's team, and looking at some of the role of cross-platform spam networks and various kinds of networks that may or may not be attributed to nation states. And so just as on the cyber side, we have cyber mercenaries that may or may not be attributed to nation state actors. Same thing's happening on disinformation where the attribution becomes very, very difficult as far as whether it's state connected or not. Philippines, I think we know Duterte is pretty well known for leading various kinds of disinformation campaigns against his public. In response, there has been the white trolls pushing back both against Duterte, but also just pushing out and shaping reality for companies, for celebrities. So it's a broad clientele that a lot of these new companies are using, and that's where you get to the disinformation for hire. And so some of the rise of the black PR firms. And so it really makes a complicated landscape that's out there. Hopefully we've now provide some of an equalizer to show you how broad it is and what some of the impact can be. And so I think what we'd like to do next is go into some of the campaigns. And Melanie's going to segue off of some of this notion of the privatization and the disinformation for hire and walk through a specific example.
All right, so this is a very beautiful landscape from the Great Barrier Reef, and I'm showing this to you for a couple of seconds. Take it in, because after this, what I'm going to show you is ugly as sin. So this is the pretty part that I want you to appreciate for the next few seconds. So this is a snippet of the current landscape of advertising, marketing, and public relations firms, as well as my least favorite, which is influencer marketing. But these, if you can't see all of the logos, it's because there's so many. And there are even more. These are charts that I borrowed from the internet. There's a lot more. And I'm showing you this just so you can get a sense of all of the players and all of the actors that are involved in this space, how big the ecosystem is, how deep the economic incentives are for not just platform companies, but for all of the companies that are involved in this, whether you're the marketer, you are the broker, there are various degrees of integrity, even with legitimate PR firms. So it is no wonder that to the average person, the internet feels like this. There is no way to get out, and might feel a little bit uncomfortable. And a lot of that has to do with some of the metrics that the industry is using. This image I actually really love this image. It is from, I do a lot of cave diving in Tulum, and so they have these caverns called cenotes, and this is the image that they put on the warning sign that you've gone too far. So we are at the point where, as an industry in marketing, advertising, and public relations, we have gone too far. And I believe a lot of that has to do with the common metrics that exist in our industry. And I want you to think about, as I go through the next couple of slides, the parallels that this profession and this group of companies and industry is going through, what that has in common with those of us in information security as well. It's not like security has really great metrics either. Right? So we're all kind of in this hand-wavy metrics confusion situation together. And that intersection of information and cyber and the fact that nobody knows how to measure it effectively in a way that doesn't hurt people is kind of why we're all in this situation together. So some of the more common and really terrible metrics that we have as an industry are things like mentions. Now, mentions is essentially just counting how many times you got quoted or mentioned in a press article. I don't know what that means, but it is widely used across the industry as something to be proud of and a measurement for success. Impressions, equally pointless, is essentially about the potential audience that could have maybe seen your message. So things like subscriber numbers, readership numbers of a publication. Again, I'm not really sure the value of measuring all of the people who subscribe to the New York Times versus the people that maybe read the article versus maybe read the whole article versus read the article through to the end, saw my comment, and actually formed an opinion about it and then did something. So there's, like I said, there's a lot of hand-waving metrics going on. Share of voice is really popular with PR firms. This is essentially, if you pick a topic or you pick an area of interest, share of voice is a measurement of how much you get visibility in that conversation versus other competitors or peers in the space. And so you can imagine on certain hot topics for any particular industry, they're going to be thinking about, are we driving the public narrative or is it being driven by somebody else? That is essentially what this metric is trying to do. But again, it's all based on things like how many times you got mentioned in an article. Getting mentioned in an article is really not a direct correlation to your influence on the issue. Engagement is a metric that has come up in recent years, particularly because of social media platforms. I also don't know what it means if somebody retweets you. Like, I don't know that that justifies my spend in any way. But the reason that I have things like engagement and click-throughs is because there is a lot of focus on platform companies right now in regards to misinformation, and that's warranted. But it's also important to remember who those platforms' customers are and why are platforms like Twitter and Facebook creating platforms where engagement is the goal. And it's because they have a customer who needs to go to a meeting tomorrow with an executive and have a number. So we've made up numbers that mean nothing, but make us feel like we are delivering value to our organizations. This last metric, advertising value equivalency, one of my least favorites. It's essentially PR professionals trying to one-up our advertising colleagues to say, we got this much visibility for something for a lot less money than if you had just purchased an ad or a commercial. It still doesn't actually lead to any outcomes, however. And so it's important, I think, to also think about, there's this shift happening within the industry where it's moving from being an art to maybe being more of a science. It's kind of like a dark science. But I do think it's important to note that the industry is trying to mature in terms of quantitative measurement. And I think those of us in cybersecurity can appreciate that effort. However, the root of these metrics are not, they lend themselves to a lot of distrust and a lot of manipulation. And so at the same time that these professions are going into executive meetings to lay out their numbers, what's interesting is that industry awards, the awards that we give ourselves and each other, are still focused on the creativeness of the campaign. So to me, it's a red flag when the way that we are trying to demonstrate value to our organizations doesn't actually align with how we ourselves value what we're doing. That should cause more of these organizations pause if you're reporting something to your business that is not actually how you value your profession. And so I want to go through one campaign in particular. So Bell Pottinger, and I'm using this example because this company is no longer in business and because I'm not an idiot. So Bell Pottinger is now a out-of-business British PR firm that got into a lot of hot water, mostly post-2016. They were notorious for representing like dictators and repressive regimes, and quite honestly, celebrities that have been accused of despicable crimes like murder. And in 2016, it came to light that they had been hired by a group of brothers, these 3 billionaires from India who had very strong economic ties and empire that they were building in South Africa. And the whole point of this campaign and the reason why the PR firm was retained was to create racial tension in the country in order to distract media and public attention from the crazy corporate things that this group was doing in the country. And in less than a year, they lost all of their clients. They had to fire all of their employees. And the entire company just went underwater. The crazy thing is that one of the founders, Tim Bell, actually said on the record that morality is a job for priests, not PR men. And so you can think about the problem that we have as an industry in terms of information developers, sharers, exchangers, that there doesn't really seem to be a sense of morality or integrity within either of the industries that I work in. And as a result, there isn't really a standard for professional communication, agencies or even professionals in terms of, we don't have an accreditation that's mandatory. We have PRSA, which is the Public Relations Society of America. We have IABC, which is the International Association of Business Communicators. Each of those do have their own accreditation with an ethics standard, and you can certainly get kicked out of that group if you violate their code of conduct, but it's not mandatory to be in that group in order to practice the profession. And so that makes it increasingly difficult to actually enforce and police any type of intentional misinformation that's being spread online. And so the last thing that I want to close with, and then we'll move on to the next campaign, is that there are also a lot of media outlets now that are actually owned by some of the clients of these various firms. Advocacy groups can also get paid to seemingly represent a certain position within an issue. So I know this is a challenge for advocacy groups to consistently assert their independence and to make sure that, if you're taking donations or funding from any organization, that you're being fully transparent and that is not affecting your decision as an organization. And so there's a lot of things that are coming together here to actually create this ecosystem that is just so ripe for professional lying. And I think it's one of the reasons why I think, those of us in the security space just need to be really aware of this, or it's really easy to get caught up in it. Please poke your PR teams, your marketing teams, your advertising teams, make sure that everything is carefully fact-checked. Call them out on any type of hype or bullshit. And make sure, the one thing that I will add is make sure your documentation is really good. I will tell you the hardest thing for a communications professional who's actually trying to seek the truth is an incomplete fab ticket. Make sure that your stuff is documented, that there is really clear receipts on why decisions were made, why certain paths were taken, even changes to your code base. All of that needs to be documented because we will need it in order to make sure that what we're sharing is accurate and honest.
Great. Thank you. Renee, yep, sure.
Handheld, all right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of comparative TTP analysis, tactics, techniques, procedures of Internet Research Agency versus the GRU, which is some work that I've done over the last 3 years. But more broadly, at Stanford Internet Observatory, we look at everything from forensics of attributed campaigns to proactive detection and working on attribution for emerging campaigns to policy solutions related to and kind of drawn out from what we learn in the course of understanding those campaigns. So we've also recently done work on Taiwan, Saudi Arabia, and we just announced a Poland project. So if you want to see what this looks like beyond Russia, particularly Saudi Arabia, which actually does hire mercenaries to run its campaigns quite regularly, I would definitely encourage you to kind of hit up our blog at some point. I want to talk about these two actors which operated concurrently in the US over a multi-year period. They operate, in fact, globally, so they are not limited to the US, but I'm going to use US examples for the purposes of this talk just to kind of condense it down a bit. I want to talk about it from the standpoint of understanding frameworks for how we think about propaganda and disinformation. That's why I think these two kind of compare and contrast quite well. So when we talk about the Internet Research Agency, and this is the thing that has kind of really dominated the conversation on influence operations and disinformation campaigns over the last almost 4 years now, 3 years, the IRA should be understood as memetic propaganda and a form of social manipulation. So the content produced was largely memes. Memes are units of cultural capital. We think of them as kind of like the cat picture, but they're actually intended to be kind of a remix culture, like a block, a gene, in fact, of remix culture that spreads from person to person. They are intended to be shared. That is the entire point. The entire point is, of course, to create something that really communicates a message to the in-group in very few words, very discreet. You can't hold a complex, nuanced conversation in a meme. You're going to get 6 words. But as long as it is well targeted, as long as it makes people feel a certain way, it's emotionally evocative, the prompt is for them to continue to share it. And in doing so, they continue to spread the message. And one thing that the IRA was particularly good at was they branded all of their content. So Angry Eagle was one of their Instagram accounts. It really targeted young conservatives. There's a degree of audience segmentation and sophistication that sometimes gets glossed over in the media. The extent to which they understood exactly what subset, what subsegment even, of a particular audience they were talking to is actually quite remarkable. And so Angry Eagle targeted very young conservatives. This kind of content, they did not create this meme. This meme actually came from, it's been possibly attributed to Turning Point USA. We've seen a couple others that were attributed to Turning Point USA, but it moved around through kind of like the alt-right, young conservative cluster that was active on the internet in the kind of 2015 to 2017 timeframe. This was distinctly different than the kind of older conservative content they were producing with a lot of American flags on Ronald Reagan. So there were age segmentations, there were interest segmentations. They weren't just producing quote unquote conservative content. They had an understanding of how to target and to whom. They did a really good job of understanding memetics from the standpoint of grabbing something that had some resonance elsewhere and then repurposing it. So this meme about amnesty, which was a big topic of conversation during the election, but also important to note, most of this content was active from about 2014 through 2017. So the election happened during that time, but this was a long-term operation that was happening, and social issues were the vast majority of the kind of content that was being put out. The political content was actually around 10% or so of candidate mentions. So what they were doing was they were leaning into these issues that were hot button issues in the American political and social conversation. They actually grabbed this particular image, we traced it back to in 2014, somebody posting it on a message board. So this was not actually originally social network native conversation. This came just from a message board, and then it was pushed onto Facebook and rebranded by them in a number of different ways. They operate to some extent like a marketing agency, and so oftentimes you'll hear them referred to as like the troll farm, the kind of troll marketing agency. One of the things that was really interesting was when we had the data set, their Army of Jesus account, which is quite popular, tons and tons of engagements. What we saw from that was actually it started out as a Kermit the Frog meme page. So they were trying a lot of different kind of American cultural iconography. What could they use to speak to people? What would grow an audience? And so you see them really trying so many different things and using metrics, engagement metrics in particular, to see what sticks. And so they actually evolved this before the page found Jesus. It was a Kermit the Frog meme page, and then when they decided that Kermit wasn't hitting as well, they moved it to be a Simpsons meme page, and then all of a sudden, like I said, it finds Jesus, and all of a sudden the content is 100%. It was about 100% Jesus, but with like 10% of, and also Jesus hates Hillary, kind of like stuck in there. So that's how, again, in a sort of standard, like canonical 1960s propaganda tactics that are just deployed for the internet age. The idea of like, in order for propaganda to work, it has to be immersive. And so they are trying constantly to create this immersive environment. It's not the idea of propaganda as touch, which I think is how some people, particularly in the media, report it out. It's not that if you saw one meme, your heart or mind would be changed. It's that you're put into these immersive environments. The memes are repeated across pages, so again, they had some idea of what their winners were, and when they found winners, they spread it to as many of their accounts as possible. Again, these were ones that were particularly engaging for their audience. Oh, and you can see the turning point icon up there on the top, which has been removed and replaced with their rebrand down there on the bottom, and for the Rand Paul meme. And the point of that, of course, is you see this content, it's branded Stop All Invaders, you think, wow, I really like this Stop All Invaders content, let me go follow them on Instagram. So we see some of the content, these were some of the most popular. Again, engagements is not impact in the sense of when we gauge, did this change a heart or mind? We can't really make that assumption, we can't make that determination based on the data that I was given, which didn't include comment data. But what we can see is that these things were liked, shared, commented on hundreds of thousands, close to 1 million in this case with the Yosemite Sam times. So we do try to understand and contextualize these things relative to stuff like CrowdTangle stats for similar types of content at the same time. It's not a direct parallel, but we do try to understand where it fell. And we could see that some of the conservative pages and 1 or 2 of the Black community targeted Instagram accounts did perform very well, even relative to authentic American produced similar media at the time. Once you have people following 1 or 2 of your pages, that's where you start to see the networking to create that immersive environment that kind of, once you're following one of their pages, the whole point is to recruit you into the sort of broader media ecosystem. And I apologize, this is a lot fuzzier up there than it is on mine. But what we looked at is the ways in which, if you can see the different colors, the red dots are Internet Research Agency accounts, and the blue dots are real community media accounts that they mentioned. And so this is on Instagram. So what you would see is you would see them shouting out or reposting or regramming this content from real community media, which in turn, through kind of spirit of reciprocity, would do it back to them. And so by doing this, they really integrate themselves into, most effectively in the Black community, but again, also in certain parts of the conservative community. You can see up there at the top, the extremely kind of loosely linked ones, that was their feminism and general kind of left-leaning stuff. It was really very significantly underdeveloped relative to the Black community and the conservative community. They went after some social issues. Their feminism page was mostly like these kind of like, it was literally they were cribbing from a t-shirt company that made like platitude t-shirts. So many times actually that when I saw the mentions, I actually wondered if that t-shirt company was an Internet Research Agency account. And I sent a DM and I'm like, hey, so like, where would I go to buy your products if they hypothetically existed? And their customer service person actually did write back. But it was, again, it's an example of like so much repurposing of that content, so much incorporation into like the sort of real community media, the real stuff that it was very hard at times to figure out what was theirs and what wasn't. And so even though we had been given the pages and these accounts as attributed by the companies, of course, sometimes the companies miss one or misattribute. So we did do a lot of digging into trying to understand which of those other ones were in fact real. But what comes next is actually this kind of recruitment of the unwitting. And this is where it gets out of the realm of social media. And this is where when we talk about things like impact, we look to understand how they turned real people into inadvertent, unwitting, the phrase in kind of Soviet times was useful idiot. But the people who become unwittingly a part of the operation. And they do that by encouraging them to participate in the community. So again, the propaganda is never phrased as like, you should do something. It's always, we need to. As members of the Black community, we shouldn't vote for Hillary. So it's always framed as something that like draws you in, reinforces you in your identity, and that's the mechanism by which it operates. And then as a member of that community, of course you want to advance the interests of that community. Of course you want to help them. And so you're going to show up to the protest and take video, which you're going to DM back to them, and then they're going to use that in their next propaganda campaign with on-the-street video of unrest in the streets of America. And that was how they were carrying out the sort of real-world aspect of this. And then my favorite part of the content was actually them posting, particularly in the conservative community clusters, about how they didn't exist. And so this was during 2017 when people were beginning to talk about whether there had been a Russian influence operation and beginning to try to understand what had happened on Facebook. And that's when these memes were coming out. Mommy, there are monsters on the bed. It's probably just the Russians, right? And so that's where you start to see them diminishing and turning it into a joke. The very idea that Russia would have interfered, again, producing content and propaganda for the audience that was most likely to believe that. So then we look at a very different type of operation that was actually happening at the same time. So the GRU, Russian military intelligence. So one thing I'll say, when we talk about like mercenary organizations and things, the Internet Research Agency is not an arm of the Russian government. It is owned by a Russian oligarch, but that provides an extent of plausible deniability that, as Putin has said, these are just some patriotic trolls. God only knows what they're doing. We certainly didn't tell them to do anything. The GRU is Russian military intelligence. That plausible deniability does not exist. It is controlled by the Kremlin. So we have an interesting situation here where you have the plausible deniability, memetic, social stuff happening on one hand, and then simultaneously you begin to see, this was from a page trying to paint US opposition to the Russian invasion of Crimea as like rank hypocrisy because of course the US had invaded so many countries in the past. But what was interesting about it was where the IRA was all like social memes, what you see from the GRU is really like strong geopolitically focused activity. So kind of a significant level up in terms of the kind of type of content and the degree of sophistication to even understand the memetics that they were going for, like a strong sense of history and things like that. But ultimately, their memes failed. So as a social influence operation, on the left are the Facebook pages that I was given, and you can see on the right total engagement. Total engagement across all of these pages, which spanned a period of literally years, ranging from 2012 to 2018, late 2018, was 14,000. So if you've ever run a Facebook page or run a marketing campaign, you know that that is like abysmal. That like with like a couple $100, you should be able to do better than that. Contrast that with the Internet Research Agency, which was about 167 million engagements. So even though engagements are not a proxy for impact, when we look at these operations kind of side by side, one of the things that we see is this glaring realization that half of these posts didn't even get a single comment. So why were they even bothering? And so this is where we look at what they were doing, right? And so I spent about probably 9 months. The IRA data set was about 400 gigs of material provided by the platforms, attributed by the platforms. The GRU data set was a collection of folders with some PDFs in them from Facebook. That was basically the name of the page, the posts, PDFs. And then we had to do the work of figuring out what it was. So this was actually a very interesting open source intelligence project for about 8 or 9 months, trying to track where this content appeared elsewhere on the internet to understand it in the broader holistic information environment space, not as a social influence operation at all, but as narrative propaganda. And what began to emerge was a picture of media manipulation instead. So rather than going peer-to-peer and trying to produce content that you yourself want to share, what you see instead is significant narrative long form, pushing a particular geopolitical version, a particular state-aligned point of view on geopolitical activities. And the way that they did that was by creating first these kind of front authority figures. We called them like Potemkin pages from the Potemkin village, which is kind of a maybe an obscure cultural reference, I won't go into it now, but this was a page called Inside Syria Media Center. Inside Syria Media Center purported to be a news organization, a media organization, with about 8 or 9 reporters operating to tell the true truth of the Syrian conflict. And so what they did was they created this very legitimate seeming, extremely high volume, kind of looked like a news agency that was reporting out constantly on what was happening in Syria. And in the course of doing that, they created a series of personas. In my slide here, this is actually, I probably should have done this slightly differently, not the Inside Syria Media Center reporter, but I grabbed this guy because he's nice and kind of distilled down. This is a persona named Andrew Kolkovich. Andrew Kolkovich is the first persona that we were able to find. This is the oldest. This was like kind of V1. Andrew Kolkovich was a quote-unquote reporter or contributor for this site. Newsland is a anyone can contribute kind of site. But what Andrew Kolkovich was writing about was how the US should continue to hate Japan. And why should the US continue to hate Japan? Well, it turns out Japan and Russia were involved in a territorial dispute about the Kuril Islands. This apparently is a territorial dispute that, as I learned, has gone unresolved since World War II. This is a very old gripe. But here in 2012, we see them beginning to push this kind of gripe out onto social media. And so we have the guy asking and answering questions on Quora. He claims to be a University of Oregon employee. He has a Twitter account. He's got a Facebook page, stub profile, really poorly done. Again, the Twitter account, meaningless, hands, iconography, no banner, no nothing. But he's tweeting out his own writing. And as we start to map our understanding of how Andrew Kolkovich fits into this operation, again, this is persona number 1. This is the oldest one that we have evidence of. We begin to see that there's so on the left are the Facebook pages. So there's Andrew Kolkovich True to Life, which was a Facebook page made kind of to be a fan page for his writing. Then there's The Destiny of Russian Kuril Islands, which is their page where they're griping about who owns the Kuril Islands. And of course, Andrew Kolkovich is authoring content, and The Destiny of the Russian Kuril Islands is sharing his content. And so this is kind of brought together. The page is grabbing articles from the internet. Andrew Kolkovich is writing the articles on the internet. Mbene Group is a fake think tank. They begin to stand up not only fake media organizations, but fake think tanks. And that's because these are organizations that we treat as sort of authoritative sources. Our inclination is not to think, well, that think tank must be fake or a front of Russian military intelligence. Our inclination is to think, even if we don't agree with the point of view, there is likely some legitimacy. And the value of this is when someone is writing, going back to Inside Syria Media Center, we would see RT and Sputnik doing things like saying, according to the experts at Inside Syria Media Center, comma. And so they're able to use their fronts, use their personas to create this perception of authority, that this is the point of view on this geopolitical event that you should take seriously. So Andrew Kolkovich is sharing content from Mbene Group, even though he didn't write for it. So they use each of their personas as producers as well as amplifiers of content. So again, sorry you can't see the lines here, but what we did was we identified a collection of fake personas and then began to look to understand to what extent these personas produced content and where that content wound up. And what we saw was that each of these personas, Sophie Mangal and Alice Donovan are the two that were actually exposed by the FBI, and then a number of articles about them were written. So those two appeared in our data set, and alongside them, as we were going through this data and tracing back, kind of like through archives and everything else, where this content appeared, you could see that each of these personas had a unique kind of political point of view, a regional focus, and then they also all contributed content to what we would call the kind of mainstream, mainstream's not main, I guess, independent media ecosystem in the United States, and that's where you see like Global Research, Counterpunch, Veterans Today, these sorts of pages that are seen as being an alternative to the mainstream media, but have large followings themselves. So even though, maybe the zoom in will help a little bit, even though they are failing at getting social engagements on their own pages, when they write the article and contribute it to Veterans Today, and Veterans Today shares it to their page, that's where you see the engagement come in. So that's where you'll see 5 million engagements, 5 million views, that's where you'll see the real engagement will come through the laundering process at the end point, if that makes sense, as opposed to on the stub Facebook page or profile that they've created for themselves. And then they use these amplifying accounts to kind of push stuff out into pages and groups. And that's where we start to see a little bit of that kind of the pushing into those closed communities. So this is where the spear phishing and the hack and leak activity is done in part in service to having these sorts of narratives that then can be picked up by the media, laundered through the media, and then move towards getting into the kind of a canonical example here would be like DC leaks. They go, they do the hack, they try to push it out on social, they fail on social, they give it to WikiLeaks, they give it to media. Media then begins to write the story, and each time they release a tranche of documents, they control the media narrative. So again, we see this media manipulation, this narrative-first operation, that the goal is not to have social, the goal is really to run things through this entire other channel. And that's why they're operating simultaneously, but they're running two completely different strategies. So just in closing, I think this is where we look at detection as a challenge and detection is a challenge and attribution is getting a lot harder. So as we do this research, as we try to understand operational frameworks for these things, we actually do draw a lot on cybersecurity methodologies, thinking about staging, thinking about attribution, thinking about ways to kind of collaborate and understand sort of persistent threat actors in the form of state actors in the information space. Thanks.
Okay, and we have a little over 10 minutes left to go, and so I'd like to start getting people, if they have questions, to start lining up. And before that, or while we're waiting for that, anyone have questions? I just want to quickly go into, we've heard a lot about, this isn't new. Disinformation, propaganda, all this trying to shape reality is not new. One of the things that we are dealing with a lot, though, right now is that the algorithms and propagation are escalating it. They're allowing micro-targeting the subsets of populations and widespread reach. And I was just looking quickly through some of the events going on right now. Australian wildfires, the anti-boycott Amazon, that's oregano oil, which apparently some are purporting is a cure for coronavirus. So it's hitting all aspects of every current event going on right now. And so I just want to keep that in mind, and there's just many different ways that the algorithms are being, they're being gamed. There's astroturfing. We're having the micro-targeted the ads, and some of the platforms are responding in turn to that. There are also algorithms that are determining where companies are financing, and some of those determinations are actually funding some of the state-run propaganda sites. And so there have been some recent articles on that where you have got Geico, Amazon, Walmart, some of the big companies are funding RT unknowingly, because that's where the algorithms are sending them. And so there's lots going on there. We're getting more complicated with the deep fakes, voice mimicry, read fakes. So it's an evolving landscape that's going to become more complex. But the nice thing about this also, it's a dual-use technology, and so we also can leverage some of the technology for the solutions as well. And so I think the questions will probably get into some of the solutions as well, but I think all of us here look at it as it's going to be a combination of the legal, the social, the technical, all aspects of our community coming together to try and address this. And so with that, I think we'll save some time right now for Q&A. I guess start over here.
Michael Lohman, Coteo. I was wondering how effective the use of the graph techniques can be in determining which accounts are false or otherwise fronting, like share, that sort of thing, compared to a real user.
So we use that, we'll map a network, and then things that look to only be involved in a particular operation, like they have no backstory, no back accounts. When you look at the tweets, you see the language change. That was one of the things we saw with China. It's usually intended to be a flag for an analyst to then go do further work. So we don't rely on things like bot assessment scores at this point. We just don't think they're very reliable a lot of the time. We do work in conjunction with the platforms as well. So when we see things that are anomalous, one of the things that we'll do is we'll actually flag it and communicate with somebody on Twitter's integrity team and say, this is where we think anomalous behavior is occurring. Here's how we would describe it. Here's our kind of confidence level in a potential attribution or what we think it might be. Here's why. What do you think? And so we do have that. We've been working pretty hard on building relationships to ensure better attribution and better identification. yeah, I don't think it's something that you can do wholly on your own on the outside anymore.
Thanks.
Great. And we'll go to the right.
I wanted to ask briefly the panel's opinion on some points made by Neil Stephenson, the sci-fi author. He just published a book on this topic, and it like 50 years from now, all of the disinformation topics that you've been talking about are like 100 times worse. And he makes 3 points. One is that if you're a person who's trying to spread the truth, you have to weaponize these tools, and that's the only defense that's going to exist. And that access to truth is a privilege of the upper class. And the third point is that these bespoke realities that you talked about are going to become the norm, and they're just whole populations that we're going to lose. So I wonder if you all could speak to some of those projections.
I mean, I'll start, and I'll just start by saying I don't see current reality as particularly much different than what I have seen throughout my entire career. I think because I come from that background of like, I know how the legitimate businesses, or I'm legitimate businesses, like trying to manipulate people with information is not a new concept. And what I think we're seeing, I mean, we saw the trend first in like marketing and advertising and PR, where it was all of a sudden now we have the internet, and there were all of these talks and all these blog posts about, oh my God, PR is changing because of the internet. It didn't, in terms of the fundamental objectives. What changed was the tools that were available to us, and the ability, I think Renee pointed this out very well, the ability to have more integrated campaigns across different types of platforms and formats. But I personally, if it gets worse, I think it will look like this. Because I just think it's a problem that's existed for so long, and what we're talking about now is tools rather than a new measure of human nature.
All right, we'll go over here.
Hi, Colin Chisholm, Zebra Technologies. It seems that one of the major actors in this entire sort of ecosystem of disinformation are the individuals who are engaging or propagating, the content that's being generated. Has there been any research done to identify the demographics of people who are more active in that, or is it really just everybody on every social media platform?
It's just InfoSec on Twitter.
There's a couple of academic papers that have come out recently, one on Twitter and I think one on Facebook, looking at the prevalence of older people, actually, who are not digital natives and seem to be challenged by not looking at the domain that created the content that they're sharing, thinking that all news is kind of equivalent news. And so even looking at things, Tristan Harris and other people have done work on what are the ramifications of design in kind of like Facebook kind of stripping out branding and just all media looks identical. And so there has been some work done looking at that. What we saw though with the IRA engagement data, again, they're left-leaning, kind of the feministy type content was just bad. It just wasn't very sophisticated. It wasn't very good. The content that was better, the content, particularly the race divisiveness for the Black community content, and then the kind of Confederacy type communities, the engagement was very high, and we couldn't see the demographics of the people in it. But judging by the fact that the content was targeting younger people, and some of the early ad campaigns were targeting different age ranges, starting at 18. People of all types engage with this stuff.
Thank you.
Over there.
Stefan Samoji from Google. Both Melanie and Renee talked about motivations, but the one motivation area that I'm still struggling with that I didn't hear covered much is sort of the apparent nihilism, or in some cases the sort of stochastic terrorism of some of these campaigns, where it's not entirely clear exactly what they're chasing. They're putting a lot of energy into it, and they're creating an awful lot of discord and dissonance, but the ultimate outcome seems decidedly unclear. And I was curious if either of you had sort of a take on that. Are they just chasing engagement? Is this just a form of particularly malevolent A/B testing? Like, how do these almost nihilistic campaigns, what's the outcome at the far end?
I can start. I think you probably know more than I do on this topic. But my immediate thought is that it could very well be an experiment to see what will stick and to be able to identify an upward trend and get on at the ground level as new content starts to stick and take off.
A lot of what's roughly kind of, I think, I don't even remember if I still had the trolls up there, but like the stuff that comes out of 8chan and 4chan, the kind of for the lol stuff, it's fighting the culture wars, right? It's like, they're culture warriors fighting the culture war online, and that's the point of view, and that's what they're kind of going for. Sometimes it's, the sort of like, trolly mischief really did kind of take a dark turn at some point over the last 5 years, probably around 2015, 2014 maybe, the kind of like when it became like Gamergate and you started to see a lot of the, again, a lot of the activity where there was that line between coordinated activism and freedom of expression, and then things that really moved into the realm of harassment, misinformation, targeting people with lies to try to ruin their lives, ruin their careers, targeting companies with the same kind of thing. Some of the actions against companies that may take a particular social position that they disagree with, and so that kind of trolling is really done as sort of like another front in the culture war.
I think there's also this aspect where some of these campaigns are organizations that are recruiting individuals to participate or propagate the campaign. And I think some of this malicious trolling is essentially individuals who, unfortunately, that is who they are as people, and they find each other and form a group. So it's a bit more organic in the sense that it may just be for personal fulfillment of the individuals who are participating.
Cool, thanks.
Great, and we got time for maybe one or two more questions, and I appreciate everyone so far keeping these as questions, so we're able to get through some more, so thank you.
Hi, Francie Rosner, University of Washington. One thing I find really interesting is this breakdown of different strategies and different motivations of different actors, because presumably different defensive strategies will be effective against them. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that. And so, for example, the more politically motivated examples that we talked about here seem like they might be different from more financially motivated ones. That's one thing that we didn't talk about yet too much that I find really interesting is the role of just the advertising ecosystem, not just in its ability to target, but also to finance operations. And so I guess it's a broad question, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts about the breakdown of these different scenarios and which are more important or more difficult or easier to target, or if there's things that we can do to kind of target defending against all of them at once.
So I'll be really fast because I just have one initial thought on this is I really think it's not just platforms that have to be regulated. I think there are a lot of people in the information industry that need a lot more oversight in terms of what they're allowed to spread and how they can spread it. And I don't mean in terms of like censoring content, but I mean, for example, like why is it okay for a PR firm to create a whole bunch of trolling accounts on behalf of a company and get paid for that? So that would be like my initial thought is that I think regulation on just the platforms is not enough.
To answer, because I know we have a couple like seconds left. We've done some, again, drawing on like the kind of kill chain methodology, looking at staging and then looking at actor types and how they intersect with that. We do constantly, in every campaign, every type of campaign, so much of it comes back to fake accounts. And so one of the things that I've been working on is some writing around what does the future of identity on the internet look like, right? How do you think about that as, since that is the linchpin of so much of this, how do we preserve anonymity? How do we preserve persistent pseudonymity? Maybe we move towards persistent pseudonymity, but how do we think about understanding the kind of bulk account creation process? I have slides with like the various black markets where you can buy them. We know state actors buy them. We know spammers buy them. There's like, people are like farming digital identities at this point. You just create a couple and grow your personas and then flip them. And you have all of these different things that you can choose from. Like the vintage of the account is likely, particularly if it started before times when Facebook was more actively policing the creation of accounts at creation. Vintage accounts from like 2009, 2010 are worth a ton of money on the black markets. And so there is this interesting element of how do we look at that very top level first step. This is where every actor type goes first and then begin to address that.
Thanks.
All right. And thanks. And we are now out of time. We got the blinking red light. But our panelists, I'm assuming, will probably stick around at least for a few minutes. If anyone has additional questions, please feel free to come on up. But give a round of applause for a great panel. Thank you.